He ruled Seoul's underworld with an iron fist. She disappeared 3 years ago without a trace. Now, in the glittering halls of a luxury mall, their worlds collide again. But she's not alone. 3 identical boys with his eyes stand beside her, sons he never knew existed. One chance encounter. One impossible truth. A mafia boss must choose between the empire he built and the family he abandoned. Some secrets are buried. Some refuse to stay dead. And some will destroy everything you've fought to protect. This is the story of a man who had everything and the woman who took his heart when she left. Subscribe now because you won't believe how this ends. The Cartier boutique shimmered with cold elegance, crystal chandeliers casting diamonds of light across polished marble. Seojun stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching Nari examine a tennis bracelet with the focused intensity she brought to everything. Her black dress hugged her frame perfectly, designer heels clicking softly as she moved. She belonged here among beautiful, expensive things. So did he supposed, though the weight of the Glock beneath his tailored suit jacket reminded him that his world operated by different rules than the ones governing this pristine temple of wealth. What do you think? Nari held up the bracelet, platinum catching the light. Her smile was practiced, perfect. Everything about her was carefully curated, from her sleek hair to her manicured nails to the way she tilted her head when she wanted his opinion. It was one of the things that made her valuable. She understood presentation, understood that in their world, image was armor. "It suits you," Seojun said, his voice carrying the flat authority that made grown men flinch. He didn't need to raise it. 20 years in the Korean Mafia had taught him that real power whispered. Nari's smile widened. She beckoned the sales associate, a nervous young woman who'd been hovering at a respectful distance since they'd entered. The girl knew who they were. Everyone in Seoul's luxury district knew who they were. The sales associate's hands trembled slightly as she processed the transaction, and Seojun felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and emptiness that accompanied such recognition. Fear was useful. Fear kept you alive. But it was a cold companion in the spaces between violence. They left Cartier with Nari's new acquisition nestled in its velvet box, stepping into the vast atrium of the Lotte World Mall. The space soared above them, all glass and steel and aspirational capitalism. Seojun scanned the crowds automatically, cataloging exits, identifying potential threats, noting the positions of his security detail scattered throughout the floor. 3 men in suits that almost concealed their shoulder holsters, pretending to shop while keeping him in their peripheral vision. Never close enough to crowd him, never far enough to fail. Lunch. Nari linked her arm through his, and he allowed it. Their engagement had been announced 3 months ago at a gathering of Seoul's elite criminal families. Strategic alliance, they called it. Her father controlled the southern territories, and the marriage would unite their operations under one umbrella. It made sense. It was profitable. It was what Seojun had worked toward for years. It felt like wearing someone else's skin. "There's a new French restaurant on the 3rd floor," Nari continued, already navigating them toward the escalators. She was good at this, at playing the role of the mafia princess who'd found her king. Maybe she even believed it. Maybe she felt something real beneath the carefully constructed facade. Seojun couldn't tell anymore. He'd spent so long building walls that he'd forgotten what it felt like to exist without them. They were halfway to the escalators when Seojun heard it. Laughter. Children's laughter, bright and unrestrained, cutting through the mall's ambient noise like a knife through silk. Something in that sound made him stop, made his chest constrict in a way that had nothing to do with the danger instincts that kept him alive. "Seojun." Nari's voice held a question, her arm still linked through his. He turned toward the sound without thinking, his body moving before his brain could catch up. Near the fountain in the atrium's center, 3 boys were chasing each other in elaborate circles, their laughter echoing off the high ceiling. They looked to be about 3 years old, identical in every way that mattered. Same round faces, same dark curls, Same energy that seemed too big for their small bodies. And standing beside them, watching with tired amusement, was Gina. The world tilted. Seojun felt his breath catch, felt ice flood his veins and fire burn his throat simultaneously. She was older, her face carrying lines that hadn't been there before. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore jeans and a simple sweater that spoke of comfort over style. She looked exhausted. She looked beautiful. She looked like everything he'd destroyed 3 years ago when he'd walked away without explanation, choosing power over the only person who'd ever seen him as human. One of the boys broke away from the game and ran directly towards Seojun, not looking where he was going, focused entirely on escaping his brothers. The collision was gentle but inevitable. The child bounced off Seojun's leg and stumbled backward, landing on his bottom with a surprised grunt. "Sorry, mister." The boy scrambled to his feet, looking up with wide eyes. Dark eyes. Eyes the exact shade of Seojun's own, staring back at him from a face that was his face, made smaller, made innocent, made impossible. Seojun couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare at this child who carried his features like an accusation, like proof of something he'd never imagined existed. "Miho, be careful." Gina's voice cut through his paralysis. She was moving toward them, her expression shifting from motherly concern to frozen recognition in the space of a heartbeat. She stopped 3 feet away, her hand reaching out to pull Miho back against her legs. The other 2 boys flanked her, sensing something wrong in the way children do, their laughter dying. Seojun stared at Gina. Gina stared at Seojun. 3 years of silence stretched between them like a chasm filled with everything they'd never said, everything he'd never explained, everything she'd never gotten to tell him. "Seojun." Nari's voice came from very far away. "What's wrong?" He couldn't answer. His eyes moved from Gina's face to the 3 boys pressed against her, and the math was so simple, so brutal, so obvious that he felt his carefully constructed world crack down the middle. 3 years since he'd left. 3 boys who looked to be 3 years old. 3 sons. His sons. Children he'd never known existed because he'd been too much of a coward to face her, because he'd chosen the clean break, because he'd told himself she was better off without him. One of the other boys, braver than his brothers, stepped forward slightly. "Are you sick, mister? You look weird." The innocence in that question nearly broke him. Seojun opened his mouth, but no sound came out. What could he possibly say? How did you explain to a child that you were staring at proof of your greatest failure, your deepest regret, your most profound loss? Gina's face had gone pale, then flushed with something that looked like anger and fear mixed together. She grabbed all 3 boys, pulling them back, creating distance between them and Seojun. "We need to go," she said, her voice tight. "Say goodbye, boys." "But Mom," Miho started. Now, there was steel in that word, the kind of authority that came from years of solo parenting, from being the only wall between your children and a world that wanted to hurt them. The boys sensed the urgency and didn't argue. They called out hasty goodbyes and allowed Gina to herd them away, moving quickly through the crowd. Seojun watched them go, watched the 3 small heads bobbing above the sea of shoppers, watched Gina's protective posture as she guided them toward the exit. "Seojun." Nari's voice was sharper now, demanding attention. Who was that woman? He turned to face his fiancée, and for the first time in years, Seojun had no idea what to say. No calculated response, no smooth lie, no easy deflection. His legendary control had shattered the moment he'd looked into his son's eyes and seen his own reflection staring back. "Someone from before," he said finally, his voice rough. "Before what?" "Before everything. Before the Mafia consumed him completely. Before he'd accepted that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Before he'd made the worst decision of his life and convinced himself it was for the best." Nari studied his face, and he could see her mind working, cataloging his reaction, measuring it against everything she knew about him. She was smart, dangerously so, and she'd just witnessed him completely lose his composure over a woman and 3 children. The implications were obvious. "I see," she said softly, and there was a coldness in those 2 words that promised future consequences. "Perhaps we should postpone lunch." Seojun nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His security detail had closed in during the encounter, sensing threat, hands hovering near concealed weapons. He waved them off with a sharp gesture and started walking, heading nowhere in particular, just needing to move. Behind him, Nari followed in silence, her new bracelet forgotten in her purse, her perfect composure showing the first hairline cracks. Seojun had built an empire on violence and fear. He'd climbed to the top of Seoul's underworld by being smarter, harder, and more ruthless than everyone else. He'd made choices that haunted him, but never regretted them because regret was weakness, and weakness got you killed. But as he walked through the mall, passing families and couples, and people living normal lives he'd never have, Seojun felt something break open inside him. 3 boys. 3 sons. 3 chances he'd thrown away without knowing they existed. The past he'd buried had just risen from the grave, and it had his eyes. The drive back to his penthouse was silent. Nari sat beside him in the back of the black Mercedes, staring out the window at Seoul's gleaming skyline. His driver knew better than to speak. His bodyguard in the front passenger seat kept his eyes forward. The silence was oppressive, heavy with unasked questions and truths that couldn't be hidden anymore. Seojun's mind raced. 3 years ago, he'd broken things off with Gina cleanly, brutally. He'd sent one of his men to deliver the message because he'd been too cowardly to face her himself. They were done. Don't contact him. Don't look for him. It's over. He'd told himself he was protecting her, that his world was too dangerous for someone like her, someone good and pure and untouched by the blood that stained his hands. He'd never considered that she might be pregnant. Never imagined that his attempt to save her had condemned her to raise 3 children alone, without support, without explanation, without even the courtesy of a goodbye. The realization made him sick. His penthouse occupied the top floor of a luxury building in Gangnam, all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern minimalism. He'd bought it for the view and the security. You could see enemies coming from up here. You could watch the city spread out below you like a kingdom you owned. Tonight, it felt like a cage. Nari broke her silence the moment they were inside, the door closing behind them with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. "You're going to tell me everything," she said, setting her purse on the marble counter with deliberate precision. Right now. Seojun poured himself a whiskey from the bar cart, the crystal decanter heavy in his hand. He didn't offer her one. "Her name is Gina. We were together 3 years ago. I ended it." "And the children?" He took a long drink, letting the burn ground him. "I didn't know about them until today. Don't lie to me." Nari's voice was ice. "You knew the moment you saw them. I watched your face. You looked like you'd seen a ghost." "I didn't know she was pregnant when I left," Seojun said, meeting her eyes. "That's the truth." Nari studied him, her expression calculating. She was the daughter of a Mafia boss, raised in this world, trained from childhood to read weakness and exploit it. She'd been engaged once before to a rival family's heir, but that man had been killed in a territorial dispute before the wedding. She understood violence. She understood that love and strategy were often the same thing in their world. "Are you going to acknowledge them?" she asked finally. "I don't know." "You don't know." Nari laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You, who plans every move 10 steps ahead, who never acts without calculating every angle. You don't know? This is different. This is complicated," she corrected. "But it doesn't have to be. Those children are a liability. That woman is a liability. You acknowledge them, and every enemy you've made will know exactly how to hurt you. They become targets. Leverage. Weaknesses to exploit." Seojun knew she was right. The moment word got out that he had children, those boys would have targets on their backs. Every rival family, every ambitious lieutenant, Every enemy he'd made in 20 years of clawing his way to the top would see them as opportunities. Kidnapping. Ransom. Worse. Then I don't acknowledge them, he said, but the words felt hollow. Can you do that? Nari moved closer, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Can you really pretend they don't exist? Because I saw your face today, Seojun. For the first time since I've known you, I saw you completely lose control. That's not something you can fake away. He didn't answer because he didn't have one. She was right. Everything she said was strategically sound, the kind of cold calculus that kept you alive and powerful. But strategy felt meaningless when he remembered those three small faces, those dark eyes that were his eyes, that child's innocent question. Are you sick, mister? Nari sighed, and some of the hardness left her posture. She moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. I'm going to my father's house tonight, she said. You need time to think, and I need to decide what this means for us. Nari, don't. She held up a hand without turning around. I agreed to marry you because you were powerful, stable, and completely in control. That man I saw today in the mall was none of those things. So you figure out who you're going to be, and then we'll talk. She collected her purse and left without another word, the door closing softly behind her. Seojun stood alone in his penthouse, surrounded by expensive furniture and a view that cost millions, feeling more isolated than he'd ever felt in his life. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never used. His head of security answered on the first ring. I need you to find someone, Seojun said. A woman named Gina. She has 3 sons. I want to know where she lives, where she works, everything about her life for the past 3 years. And I want a DNA test arranged. Discreetly. Yes, sir. How soon? Yesterday. He ended the call and downed the rest of his whiskey, then poured another. The city glittered below him, indifferent to his crisis. Somewhere out there, Gina was putting 3 boys to bed, reading them stories, kissing them goodnight. 3 boys who were his. 3 sons he'd never held. Seojun had killed men without hesitation. He'd ordered executions, burned buildings, destroyed lives without losing sleep. But the thought of those children growing up without a father because he was too dangerous to acknowledge them made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt. The information came back within 48 hours, delivered in a manila folder by his security chief. Seojun read through it alone in his office, the door locked, his usual mask of control firmly in place despite the chaos churning inside him. Gina lived in a modest apartment in Mapogu, a working-class neighborhood far from the luxury of Gangnam. She worked 2 jobs, morning shift at a cafe, evening shift doing data entry from home. The boys attended a nearby daycare. Her parents had passed away 2 years ago in a car accident. She had no siblings, no support system beyond a few friends. She was raising his sons alone, working herself to exhaustion, with no help and no explanation for why their father had disappeared. The DNA results were attached, clinical, and irrefutable. Probability of paternity, 99.9999%. Miho, Juno, and Daeho, his sons. The report included photos taken from a distance, the boys playing at a park, Gina holding their hands as they crossed a street, all 4 of them laughing over ice cream. Seojun stared at those photos for a long time, memorizing faces he'd only seen once. Miho had his jawline. Juno had his eyebrows. Daeho had his nose. They were pieces of him, walking around in the world, innocent and vulnerable and completely unaware that their father was one of the most dangerous men in Seoul. He should walk away. Every rational calculation said to leave them alone, to let Gina continue raising them in obscurity where they'd be safe from his world. His security chief had been blunt. Acknowledging them was suicide. Within a week, rival families would know. Within a month, someone would make a move. Children were the ultimate pressure point, and he'd handed his enemies 3 of them. But Seojun couldn't stop thinking about that moment in the mall. The way Miho had looked up at him with such trust, such innocence. The way Gina had looked at him with such pain and fury. 3 years of her life, devoted to raising children he'd helped create and then abandoned without knowing they existed. He owed her more than silence. He owed his sons more than abandonment. The decision was probably going to get them all killed, but Seojun made it anyway. He picked up his phone and dialed his security chief again. "I need an address secured," he said. "And I need a meeting arranged. With the mother. Tonight." There was a pause. "Sir, I have to advise against." "I know what you have to advise. Do it anyway." Seojun ended the call before his security chief could argue further. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at Seoul's endless sprawl. Somewhere in that maze of lights and lives, his sons were probably sleeping. Gina was probably awake, working her second job, exhausted and alone. For 3 years, Seojun had told himself he'd made the right choice leaving her. For 3 years, he'd convinced himself that his world was too toxic, too violent, too irredeemable for someone as good as her. But he'd never asked what she wanted. He'd decided for her. He'd played God with her life and, it turned out, with his children's lives, and he'd been too arrogant to consider that she deserved a choice in the matter. If she told him to disappear, he would. If she told him that acknowledging his sons would put them in more danger than abandoning them, he'd walk away and never look back, no matter how much it destroyed him. But she deserved the chance to tell him that herself. The meeting was arranged for midnight in a neutral location, a closed restaurant that one of Seojun's allies owned. His security chief had been thorough, sweeping the place for bugs, posting men at every entrance, ensuring complete privacy. It was probably overkill for a conversation with an exhausted single mother, but old habits were hard to break. Gina arrived exactly on time, which didn't surprise him. She'd always been punctual. She wore the same practical clothes from the mall, and her face was carefully blank, giving nothing away. One of his men had picked her up and driven her here, probably terrifying her in the process, but she showed no fear as she entered the empty restaurant. She stopped 10 feet away from him, maintaining distance, her arms crossed. "You have 5 minutes," she said. "My neighbor is watching the boys, and I told her I'd be back by 1. Straight to business. No small talk. No acknowledgement of their history." Seojun respected that even as it cut him. "They're mine," he said. "Not a question. A statement." "Yes. Why didn't you tell me?" Gina's laugh was bitter. "You sent someone to break up with me, Seojun. You couldn't even face me yourself. You told me never to contact you, that it was over, that I should forget you existed. So I did. And then I found out I was pregnant, and I had a choice to make. Tell the man who'd thrown me away like garbage that I was carrying his children, or raise them myself with dignity. I would have helped. Would you?" She took a step closer, and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of 3 years of solo parenting etched into her face. "Would you really? Or would you have offered money and told me to stay away? Given me a payoff to keep your secrets? Sent your men to check on us occasionally while you built your empire?" She wasn't wrong. 3 years ago, that's exactly what he would have done. He would have ensured they were financially secure and kept them at arm's length, convinced he was protecting them from his dangerous world while really protecting himself from having to feel anything. "I'm different now," he said. "Are you?" "Because from where I'm standing, you look the same. Expensive suit. Dangerous men at every door. That look in your eyes that says you're calculating angles and running scenarios. You're still the same Seojun who chose power over people. I didn't know about them. And now you do." Gina's voice cracked slightly, the first sign of emotion breaking through. "Now you know, and you've dragged me here in the middle of the night, surrounded me with armed guards, and forced this conversation. So what do you want? What's the angle? What's the play? I want to know my sons." The words hung in the air between them. Gina stared at him, searching his face for deception, for the catch, for whatever strategy she assumed was lurking beneath the surface. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "No." Seojun felt that single word like a physical blow. "Gina, you don't get to do this." She was crying now, angry tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to walk away and then waltz back in when it's convenient. Those boys have a life. A safe life. A normal life. I've worked myself to the bone to give them that. And you want to what? Acknowledge them? Introduce them to their mafia boss father? Put targets on their backs? I can protect them. From everyone? From all your enemies? From every rival family and ambitious lieutenant and grudge you've collected in 20 years. She shook her head. You can't. Nobody can. The moment word gets out that you have children, they become weapons people can use against you. Is that what you want? To make them into leverage? She was right. Every strategic part of his brain knew she was right. But the part of him that had looked into Miho's eyes and seen his own reflection couldn't accept it. Then I'll keep it secret, he said. I'll stay away. I'll protect them from a distance. But I need to know they're okay. I need to. His voice broke, and he hated himself for it. Hated showing weakness. Hated that she could still undo him after 3 years. I need to do better than I did with you. Gina wiped her eyes, her expression softening slightly. Seojun, I don't hate you. I did for a while, when I was pregnant and terrified and alone. But I don't anymore. You made a choice, and I've made peace with it. The boys are happy. They're healthy. They don't know you exist, and that protects them. Can't that be enough? No. The word came out harsh, definitive. It can't. I can't walk away again. I can't pretend they don't exist. If you want me to stay away, I will. If you want me to never contact you again, I won't. But I need you to know that I'm here. That I'm watching. That if you or the boys ever need anything, anything at all, I'm one phone call away. He pulled out a card with his private number, the one only 5 people in the world had, and held it out to her. Gina stared at it like it might explode. This is a mistake, she said, but she took the card anyway. Probably. I've made a lot of them. This might be the only one I actually regret. They stood in silence for a long moment. Seojun wanted to ask about the boys, wanted to know everything, their favorite foods, their personalities, what they liked to play, what made them laugh. But he could see the exhaustion in Gina's face, the emotional toll this conversation was taking, and he forced himself to stay quiet. I need to go, Gina said finally. The boys wake up early. Okay. She turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at him. They have your eyes. All 3 of them. Sometimes, when they look at me, I see you staring back. I thought I'd hate that, but I don't. They're good boys, Seojun. They're kind and funny and full of light. They're nothing like you. Good, he said, and meant it. Gina left, escorted out by one of his men who would drive her home. Seojun stood alone in the empty restaurant, surrounded by guards and secrets, feeling more lost than he'd ever felt in his life. He'd built an empire. He'd conquered Seoul's underworld. He'd made himself into something feared and respected and powerful. And he'd thrown away the only things that mattered. The news broke 3 days later. Someone had been watching. Someone always was. Photos of Seojun and Gina's meeting appeared on the dark web forums where criminal intelligence was traded like currency. Grainy surveillance shots of them together in the restaurant, of his men surrounding the location, of Gina being driven away in one of his vehicles. The implications spread through Seoul's underworld like wildfire. The untouchable Seojun had a weakness. A woman and children. The perfect pressure point. His security chief called him at 3 a.m. We have a problem, sir. Someone leaked the meeting. The photos are everywhere. Multiple families are asking questions. Seojun was already awake, had been awake since midnight, staring at the photos of his sons that he'd kept from the surveillance file. He'd known this would happen. Had known the moment he arranged that meeting that he was exposing them. But he'd done it anyway because he was selfish, because he needed to see Gina, because he couldn't accept walking away again. Increase security on Gina's apartment, he ordered. For men, rotating shifts. They don't approach, they don't make contact, they just watch. And I want every one of my intel sources focused on chatter about the photos. Someone leaks a plan involving that woman or those children. I want to know before they finish the sentence. Sir, with respect, this is going to get expensive and complicated fast. Maybe it's time to cut. No. Seojun's voice was ice. Those children are off limits. Pass the word. Anyone who touches them, anyone who even thinks about using them as leverage, I will end their entire organization. Family, friends, associates, everyone. Total scorched earth. Make sure that message is clear. There was a pause. That's going to start a war, sir. Then we'll have a war. He ended the call and immediately dialed Gina's number, the one he'd gotten from the surveillance file, but promised himself he wouldn't use unless it was an emergency. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice thick with sleep. Hello. It's Seojun. Don't panic, but you need to listen carefully. In the next 24 hours, you're going to notice men watching your apartment. They're mine. They're there to protect you and the boys. Don't approach them. Don't acknowledge them. Just know that they're there. He could hear her sitting up, could imagine her mind racing through panic to pragmatism. What happened? Someone found out about our meeting. Photos are circulating. You and the boys might be targets now. Oh God. Her voice broke. This is exactly what I said would happen. This is why I told you to stay away. I know. You were right. But it's done now, and I'm going to keep you safe. All of you. How? How can you possibly? Trust me. I don't. The words hurt more than they should have. Then trust that I'm more terrified of something happening to those boys than I am of any enemy I've ever made. I will burn Seoul to the ground before I let anyone touch them. Silence. Then, quietly, they're asking about you. Seojun's breath caught. What? The boys. Miho especially. He keeps talking about the man at the mall, the one he ran into. He asked me who you were. I said you were nobody, just someone we bumped into, but he's smart. He knows I'm lying. What do you want me to tell him? Nothing. I want you to stay away and let us go back to our lives. But that's not possible anymore, is it? No. Another silence, longer this time. When Gina spoke again, her voice was resigned. If they're in danger because of you, then you need to fix it. I don't care how. I don't care what it costs. You fix this, or I disappear with them somewhere you'll never find us. Understand? Yes. And Seojun? She paused. If I do that, if I run, don't look for us. Don't send your men. Don't try to find us. Just let us go and live with the choices you made. She ended the call before he could respond. Seojun sat in his penthouse as dawn broke over Seoul, the city waking up below him, indifferent to his crisis. His phone buzzed with messages, his security chief coordinating protection details, his second-in-command asking for meetings, Nari's father requesting a conversation about the engagement. Everything was unraveling. The carefully constructed life he'd built was collapsing because he'd looked into his son's eyes and couldn't walk away. Maybe that made him weak. Maybe that made him a liability. But for the first time in 20 years, Seojun felt something other than the cold satisfaction of power. He felt purpose. Not the abstract purpose of building an empire or crushing enemies, but the concrete, immediate purpose of protecting 3 small boys who shared his blood and a woman who'd survived everything he'd thrown at her. He picked up his phone and started making calls. If the Underworld wanted a war over his children, he'd give them one they'd never forget. But first, he needed to make sure Gina and the boys disappeared somewhere his enemies could never find them, even if that meant never seeing them again. The plan came together over 72 sleepless hours. Seojun worked with a focus he'd never felt before, making calls, pulling favors, spending resources he'd accumulated over decades. Money flowed into accounts. Safe houses were prepared. Identities were forged. Escape routes were mapped. And through it all, he watched the surveillance feeds from Gina's apartment. Watched his sons play. Watched Gina work, exhausted but determined. Watched the life he'd never be part of unfold on screens in his office. Nari came to see him on the 3rd day. She walked into his office unannounced, ignoring his security chief's protests, and stood across his desk with her arms crossed. She looked tired, and there was something fragile in her usually impeccable composure. "My father wants the engagement called off," she said without preamble. "He says you're unstable, that you're making emotional decisions, that the photos and the war you're starting over some woman and her children prove you're compromised." Seojun leaned back in his chair, studying her. And what do you want? I want to understand why you're doing this. Why you're risking everything. Our alliance, your reputation, your empire, for people you barely know. They're my sons. So you've claimed. But you've never met them. Never held them. Never been their father in any way that matters. They're strangers who happen to share your DNA. Why does that matter so much? It was a fair question. A strategic question. The kind of cold calculus that their world ran on. Seojun had asked himself the same thing 100 times over the past few days. Because, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, for 20 years, I've built everything on the idea that power matters most. That being feared and respected and untouchable was the goal. I've sacrificed everything for that. Relationships, happiness, any chance at a normal life. And I convinced myself it was worth it, that I was building something that mattered. He paused, looking at the surveillance feeds still running on his monitors. Miho was drawing at the kitchen table. Juno was building something with blocks. Daeho was reading a picture book to himself, sounding out words carefully. But then I saw them, Seojun continued, and I realized that everything I'd built was worthless. All the power, all the respect, all the fear. It means nothing if I can't protect the 3 people who matter most. If I can't give them a better life than I had. If I can't be something other than the monster souls made me into. Nari was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. You're in love with her. Still. After 3 years. Yes. Does she love you? No. She's smart enough not to. And you're still doing this. Still risking everything. Yes. Nari moved to the window, looking out at the city the way she always did when she was thinking. My father says you're weak now. That you're making emotional choices that will get you killed. But I don't think that's true. I think you're finally making a choice that isn't calculated, and it terrifies you. She turned back to face him. I can't marry you, Seojun. Not because of what my father says, but because I deserve someone who looks at me the way you look at her. Someone who'd burn the world down for me. You're willing to do that for a woman who doesn't love you and children you've never held. I respect that, even if it's foolish. She moved to the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I hope you find a way to protect them. I hope this reckless, impossible thing you're trying to do actually works. Because if it does, maybe there's hope for the rest of us too. She left without waiting for a response. Seojun watched her go, feeling the weight of another bridge burning behind him. The alliance with her father's organization was over. Half his power base would crumble within weeks. Rivals would smell blood in the water. He didn't care. His phone buzzed with an incoming message from his security chief. Situation developing. 3 vehicles spotted conducting surveillance on target location. Unknown affiliation. Recommend immediate extraction. Seojun was moving before he finished reading, grabbing his jacket and gun, shouting orders to his men. They were in the cars within 2 minutes, racing through Seoul's streets, toward Mapogu. His security chief was on the phone, coordinating with the protection detail already at Gina's apartment. Status, Seojun barked into his phone. The vehicles haven't approached yet. They're maintaining distance, but it's clear surveillance. Professional setup. Whoever they are, they know what they're doing. Get Gina and the boys out. Now, use the back exit. Have the safe house team ready to receive them. Sir, she's refusing to leave. Says she won't go anywhere until she talks to you. Of course she was. Because Gina was stubborn and brave and refused to be pushed around, even when her life was in danger. It was one of the things he'd loved about her. It was also going to get her killed. I'm 5 minutes out. Keep the detail tight. Nobody approaches that building. The 5 minutes felt like hours. Seojun's mind ran through scenarios, each one worse than the last. His enemies weren't stupid. They knew he'd protect Gina and the boys. They knew he'd rushed security to the location, which meant this could be bait, a distraction, a way to draw him out into the open. He went anyway. His convoy pulled up to Gina's building with enough firepower to start a small war. His men deployed immediately, establishing a perimeter, scanning rooftops and windows. The 3 surveillance vehicles had pulled back, but hadn't left, watching from a distance. Seojun took the stairs 2 at a time, his bodyguards flanking him. Gina's apartment was on the 4th floor, modest and cramped compared to his penthouse. She answered his knock immediately, her face pale but composed. Behind her, he could see the 3 boys huddled together on the couch, looking scared. "You need to leave," Seojun said without preamble. "Right now? I have a safe house prepared. New identities. Money. Everything you need to disappear." "And then what?" Gina demanded. "We hide forever? Change our names? Never see our friends again? Never have normal lives? You stay alive. That's not living. That's existing. That's what you do, Seojun. You exist behind walls and guns and security. I won't do that to my children. Our children." The words came out harsh, possessive. "They're our children, and they're in danger because of me. So yes, you're going to hide, and you're going to stay hidden until I make this safe." "How? How are you going to make it safe? By killing everyone who knows about them? By starting a war? By destroying yourself?" She was crying now, and Seojun felt something crack inside him. He wanted to reach for her, to comfort her, but he had no right. He'd forfeited that right 3 years ago when he'd chosen power over love. "Mom." A small voice came from behind her. Miho stood there, small and scared and confused. "What's happening? Who's that man?" Seojun froze. His son was looking at him with those dark eyes that were his eyes, waiting for an answer that Seojun couldn't give. "What do you say?" "I'm your father, and I'm the reason bad people are trying to hurt you? I'm the monster who abandoned your mother before you were born?" Gina turned to Miho, kneeling down to his level. "Sweetie, go back to the couch with your brothers. Everything's okay." "But Mom." "Now Miho." The boy obeyed reluctantly, casting one last confused look at Seojun before returning to his brothers. Juno and Daeho were clinging to each other, and the sight of them, scared and small and vulnerable, made Seojun's decision for him. "You're leaving," he said to Gina, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Tonight, my men will take you to the safe house. It's secure, comfortable. The boys can still play, still be children. But you'll be protected. For how long? As long as it takes." "And what about you?" The question surprised him. There was something in her voice. Concern? Fear? He couldn't tell. "I'm going to end this. I'm going to make it clear that touching you or the boys means total annihilation. Not just death, but erasure. Everything they've built, everyone they love, burned to the ground. It's the only language this world understands. That's insane. You'll start a war you can't win. I'll win because I have more to lose than they do. They're fighting for territory and profit. I'm fighting for..." He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "For what?" Gina whispered. "For the only thing that's ever mattered." She stared at him, and in her eyes, he saw everything they'd been and everything they'd never be. 3 years of absence. 3 sons he'd never held. A life together that he'd destroyed before it could begin. "I don't want you to die for us," she said finally. "I'm not going to die. I'm going to make sure you can live." Before she could argue further, his phone buzzed. His security chief's voice was urgent. "Sir, the surveillance vehicles are moving. They're approaching from 3 directions. I think they're making a move." Seojun's mind shifted into combat mode instantly. "Get her and the boys to the back exit. Now. Route 2. Contact the extraction team." His men moved immediately, professional and efficient. Gina tried to protest, but one of his most trusted operatives, a woman named Ji-hyun, gently but firmly guided her toward the door. "Ma'am, please. We need to go." The boys were scared now, sensing the urgency. Gina scooped up Daeho while Ji-hyun took Juno's hand. Miho clung to his mother's leg, looking back at Seojun one last time. "Will we see you again?" the boy asked, his voice small. Seojun wanted to lie, wanted to promise that everything would be okay, that they'd all be safe and together soon. But he'd never lied to a child, and he wasn't going to start with his own son. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm going to try." Miho nodded solemnly, processing this with the seriousness of someone far older than 3. Then Gina was moving, hurrying the boys out the back door where more of Seojun's men waited. Seojun watched them go, memorizing the sight. Gina carrying Daeho, Miho and Juno holding Jihyun's hands, his men surrounding them in a protective formation. His family, disappearing into the night because he'd been too dangerous to love. "Sir." His head of security was beside him. "We need to go? Those vehicles will be here in 60 seconds. "No." Seojun pulled out his gun, checking the magazine with practiced efficiency. "We stay? Let them come." "Sir, that's suicide. That's sending a message. They wanted to make a move on my family." "Fine. Let's see how that works out for them." 6 men stayed with him. The rest went with Gina and the boys, ensuring their safe extraction. Seojun positioned himself by the window, watching as 3 black SUVs pulled up to the building. Men emerged, armed and professional. He counted 12 total, which meant they'd underestimated him. They thought he'd run, thought he'd prioritize his own safety over confrontation. They were wrong. The gunfight lasted 4 minutes. Seojun's men were better trained, better positioned, and fighting for something more than money or territory. When the smoke cleared, 8 of the attackers were dead. The other 4 had fled, leaving their vehicles behind. Seojun stood among the wreckage, his suit jacket torn, blood on his hands, some his, most not. His security chief was on the phone, coordinating cleanup and police response. Seoul's law enforcement knew better than to look too closely at incidents involving Seojun's organization, but this level of violence required management. "The family is secure," his second-in-command reported. "They're at the safe house. The woman is shaken but unharmed. The children are asleep." Seojun nodded, feeling the adrenaline drain away, leaving only exhaustion. He'd won this engagement, but the war had just begun. Every criminal organization in Seoul would know by morning that he'd killed 8 men to protect a woman and 3 children. They'd know he was willing to die for them. Some would see that as weakness. Others would see it as proof that he was more dangerous than ever. Both were right. The next 3 weeks were brutal. Seojun systematically dismantled every organization that had shown interest in using Gina and the boys as leverage. He hit their supply chains, their money laundering operations, their protection rackets. He didn't just attack, he obliterated. Buildings burned. Bank accounts evaporated. Key personnel disappeared. Seoul's underworld bled. His own organization suffered too. Without the alliance with Nari's family, his territory shrank. Rivals moved in, sensing opportunity. His council of lieutenants began questioning his decisions, muttering about emotional instability and poor judgment. Seojun didn't care. Every night, he watched the surveillance feeds from the safe house. Watched Gina tuck the boys into bed. Watched them eat breakfast together. Watched them live the normal life he'd never be part of. It was torture. It was also the only thing keeping him sane. On the 23rd day, his security chief came to him with news. "Sir, we've identified the organization behind the attack. Small outfit, ambitious, thought they could make a name for themselves by taking your family hostage. They're based in Incheon." "They were," Seojun corrected. Past tense. His security chief nodded. "They were. We hit them last night. Complete wipeout. No survivors." "Good." Seojun felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, just the cold certainty that this was necessary. "Spread the word. That's what happens to anyone who threatens my family." "Sir, there's something else. We've received a message. From the Busan cartel. They want to meet. They're proposing a truce. Territory division. They stay out of your business, you stay out of theirs. They specifically mention leaving your family alone as part of the terms." Seojun considered this. The Busan cartel was old, established, and smart enough to recognize a losing proposition. They'd seen what he'd done to smaller organizations and decided discretion was the better part of survival. Set it up. Neutral location. Maximum security. The meeting happened 3 days later in a warehouse by the Han River. Representatives from 5 major criminal families attended. Everyone who mattered in Seoul's underworld. Seojun arrived with minimal security, a power move that said he wasn't afraid of any of them. The negotiations were tense but productive. Territory was divided. Truces were established. And most importantly, a new rule was carved into Seoul's criminal code. Seojun's family was off limits. Completely untouchable. Anyone who violated this rule would face not just Seojun, but every organization in the city. They'd be hunted down and eliminated as an example. It was the best outcome he could have hoped for. His sons were safe. Gina was safe. The price was most of his empire, but he paid it without hesitation. When the meeting ended, one of the older bosses, a man who'd known Seojun since he was a young lieutenant clawing his way up, pulled him aside. "You know what you've done, right?" the old man said. "You've shown every ambitious punk in this city that the great Seojun has a weakness. You've painted a target on your back that will never go away. I know. Was it worth it? 3 children you've never held? A woman who doesn't love you." Seojun thought about Miho's eyes, about Gina's exhausted courage, about the life he'd destroyed and the one he was trying to protect. "Yes," he said. "It was worth it." The old man shook his head. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the biggest fool. Maybe both. Probably both." 2 months after the mall encounter, Seojun made a decision. He'd protected his family. He'd carved out space for them to live safely. But he was still a liability. Still a target. Still the reason they'd needed protection in the first place. There was only one way to truly free them. He spent a week making arrangements, transferring assets, setting up trust funds for the boys under shell companies they'd never be able to trace back to him, ensuring Gina would never have to work 2 jobs again, even if she never knew where the money came from. Then he called his most trusted operative, Jihyun, the woman who'd helped extract his family. "I need you to do something for me," he said. "Something that stays between us. Forever." She listened to his plan without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "That's suicide, sir." "No. It's freedom. For them, or for you. Does it matter?" She didn't answer, but she agreed to help. Because she was loyal, and because maybe she understood that sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to remove yourself from their lives completely. The plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. A meeting with a rival faction, heavily publicized. A car bomb, spectacular and fatal. Seojun's death announced across Seoul's criminal networks. His body too destroyed to identify, but enough evidence left behind to make it convincing. In reality, Seojun would disappear. New identity, new face, courtesy of a surgeon who owed him favors and asked no questions. A new life in a place where no one knew the name Seojun or cared about Seoul's criminal politics. His sons would grow up safe, never knowing their father had been a monster who loved them enough to die. The night before his death, Seojun went to the safe house. He shouldn't have. It was a security risk, a potential leak, a completely emotional decision. But he'd spent 2 months watching his children through cameras, and he needed to see them in person one last time. Gina was shocked when he arrived unannounced at midnight. The boys were asleep, and she met him at the door with fear in her eyes. "What's wrong? What happened?" "Nothing. Nothing's wrong. I just needed to see them." She studied his face, and he watched her brilliant mind work through the implications. "You're leaving. That's what this is. You're saying goodbye." He didn't deny it. She led him inside, leading him quietly to the room where the triplets slept in 3 small beds arranged in a row. They were curled up under blankets covered in cartoon characters, breathing softly, completely peaceful. Seojun stood in the doorway for a long time, memorizing their faces. Miho slept on his stomach with one arm hanging off the bed. Juno had kicked off his blankets and was sprawled sideways. Daeho clutched a stuffed elephant, his thumb in his mouth. "They're beautiful," Seojun whispered. "They're yours," Gina said softly beside him. "They have your eyes, your stubbornness, your intensity. Miho's the leader, just like you. Juno's the strategist. Daeho's the emotional one, the one who feels everything deeply. Like I used to. Before." Before you built walls so high you forgot what it felt like to be human. They stood in silence, watching the boys sleep. Finally, Seojun spoke without taking his eyes off his sons. I'm going to die tomorrow. Car bomb. Very public, very final. By the time you hear about it, I'll be gone. He felt Gina stiffen beside him, but didn't look at her. You're faking your death. Yes. And you came here to say goodbye. Yes. Why? Because I need them to remember that someone loved them, even if they never knew who I was. Because I need you to know that I'm sorry. Because I needed to see them one last time before I become someone else. Gina was crying silently now, tears streaming down her face. This is insane. You're insane. I know. You could just walk away. Leave Seoul. Start over somewhere else. You don't have to die. As long as Seojun exists, they're in danger. As long as I'm alive somewhere, someone will find out. Someone will use them against me. This is the only way to give them a normal life. They deserve to know their father. They deserve better than me. Gina grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. Her face was twisted with grief and fury and something else, something that looked like the love she'd claimed was gone. Don't I get a say in this? Don't they? You're making this decision for all of us, just like you made the decision to leave 3 years ago. When do we get to choose? You chose. You chose to protect them. You chose to give them a good life. I'm honoring that choice. By dying. By setting you free. She hit him then, her fist connecting with his chest in a blow that had no real force behind it. I hate you. I hate that you're doing this. I hate that it makes sense. I hate that you're finally being selfless and it means losing you forever. Seojun caught her hand, holding it against his heart. Tell them I was a good man. Lie if you have to. Just don't tell them the truth about what I was. And what was that? A monster who loved you more than life itself and wasn't smart enough to figure that out until it was too late. They stood there, her hand on his heart, his hand covering hers, 3 children sleeping peacefully nearby. For just a moment, Seojun let himself imagine a different life. One where he'd never entered the Mafia. Where he'd been brave enough to choose love over power. Where these boys knew his name and called him father. But that life had never been possible. Not for someone like him. He released Gina's hand and moved to each bed, kneeling beside his sons. He didn't touch them, didn't want to risk waking them, but he whispered to each one, Mijo, be strong, but remember that strength without kindness is cruelty. Lead with your heart. Juno, be smart, but remember that intelligence without compassion is cold. Think of others. Daeho, be brave, but remember that courage without love is empty. Feel everything. He stood, taking one last long look at the 3 children who were his legacy, his redemption, his reason for everything. Then he turned to Gina. There's money. Accounts under shell companies. More than enough for them to go to the best schools, have the best lives. You'll never have to work again if you don't want to. I don't want your money. I know. Take it anyway. For them. He moved toward the door, and Gina followed. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back one final time. The small room with 3 sleeping boys. The life he'd never have. The family he'd destroyed and tried to save. I love you, he said to Gina. I never stopped. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to say it when it mattered. You're saying it now. Now doesn't count. Now is goodbye. He left before she could respond, walking out into the night where his car waited. Ji-hyun was in the driver's seat, her expression carefully neutral. Ready, sir? No. But let's go anyway. The next evening, Seoul's news networks exploded with reports. Seojun, one of the city's most powerful criminal figures, had been killed in a car bombing. The explosion was massive, completely destroying the vehicle and making identification nearly impossible. His organization issued a statement confirming his death. Rival families celebrated. Law enforcement breathed a sigh of relief. Gina watched the news with the boys playing at her feet, and she cried silently, mourning a man who'd loved her badly but completely, who'd chosen death over endangering his children, who'd been too broken to heal but brave enough to disappear. 3 weeks later, a man with a different face boarded a plane to Jeju Island. He carried new papers, a new name, a new life. He would open a small bookshop in a quiet town where no one knew his past. He would live simply, carefully, anonymously. And every night, he would think about 3 boys with his eyes and wonder if they were happy, if they were safe, if they'd ever know that their father had loved them enough to die. 5 years later, the bookshop had become a fixture in the small Jeju town. The owner, Mr. Park, they called him, was quiet, kept to himself, but was unfailingly kind to the children who came in looking for picture books. He never married, never seemed to date, just ran his shop and lived alone in the apartment above it. One afternoon, a woman walked in with 3 boys, identical except for the ways children differentiate as they grow. They were 8 now, gangly and loud and full of energy. One of them, the leader, the one who took charge, immediately started exploring the shop while his brothers followed. The woman approached the counter where Mr. Park stood, his face carefully neutral despite the recognition that must have been screaming through his veins. "Gina," he said softly. "I knew you weren't dead," she said. "I knew at the moment they said your body was too destroyed to identify. That was too convenient. Too clean. You should leave. If anyone tracked you here." "No one tracked us. I'm careful. I learn from the best." She paused. "They ask about you sometimes. Miho especially. He remembers the man from the mall, the one who looked at him like he mattered." Mr. Park, Seojun, gripped the counter edge, his knuckles white. "You shouldn't have come." "I know, but they deserve to see you. Just once. Just so they know you're real." One of the boys called out from the back of the shop. "Mom, can we get this one?" Gina turned, about to answer, but Seojun spoke first. "You can have any book you want. All 3 of you. My gift." The boys cheered and dove back into their browsing. Miho lingered, studying Seojun with those dark eyes that were mirrors of his own. "Do I know you?" the boy asked. Seojun's throat closed. He wanted to say yes. Wanted to tell his son everything. Who he was, what he'd done, why he'd disappeared. Wanted to pull the boy close and never let go. Instead, he smiled softly. "No, but I hope you find a book you love." Miho nodded, apparently satisfied, and rejoined his brothers. Gina watched Seojun's face, saw everything he was holding back, saw the love and pain and regret written in every line. "We're happy," she said quietly. "The boys are thriving. I got my degree. We have a good life." "Good. But they have a hole where their father should be. Money can't fill that. Safety can't fill that. Nothing can fill that except you. I'm dead, remember? Not to them. To them, you're just absent. There's a difference." They stood in silence while the boys explored, laughing and arguing over which books to choose. A normal scene. A glimpse of the life Seojun had given up to give them safety. Finally, Gina spoke again. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking you to be their father. But maybe, once in a while, we could visit. Maybe they could know the man in the bookshop who gives them free books and asks about school. Maybe that could be enough. That's dangerous. Living is dangerous. You taught me that." The boys returned with their selections, adventure stories and comic books, and one about dinosaurs. Seojun wrapped them carefully, his hands steady despite the chaos in his heart. As they were leaving, Miho turned back one last time. "Will you be here if we come back?" Seojun looked at Gina. She looked back at him, her expression open, vulnerable, hopeful. "Yes," he said. "I'll be here." The door closed behind them, the bell chiming softly. Seojun stood alone in his bookshop, surrounded by stories of heroes and villains and redemption. And for the first time in 5 years, he let himself cry. The past couldn't be changed. The choices couldn't be unmade. The man he'd been, the monster called Seojun, was dead and buried. But maybe, just maybe, the man he was becoming could learn to be the father his sons deserved, even if they never knew his real name. If you made it this far, you've just experienced a story about love, sacrifice, and the impossible choices we make for the people we cherish. Drop a comment below telling me what you thought. Would you have made the same choice as Seojun? Did the ending satisfy you or break your heart? And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe because I've got more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.